Well, this comment section is gonna be fun. So just the other day, I put up a video talking about the new Netflix series Iron Fist that's coming out soon, and just basically sort of rambling my thoughts on what if the early reviews are in fact accurate and the thing sucks. Now, pretty much I confined my conversation to just my general thoughts about how it might have gotten that Marvel actually would put out a product that is of notably lower quality than other stuff they put out, and what that might mean going forward. One thing I made a real point of not bringing up was the cast and the race of the lead character of Danny Rand, the Iron Fist. The reason I didn't bring that up is because honestly I'm really kind of burned out on the whole racial thing after I mentioned it in my last Ghost in the Shell thing, and the comment section turned into just a cesspool. But despite making a point of not bringing that up in my last Iron Fist video, it got brought up in the comment section anyway. So you know what? If you guys are gonna sling this crap in my comment section no matter what, then at least I'm gonna say my piece. Now, before I get started, I'm gonna say this, even though I know it won't matter. The people who are really adamant on either side of this argument, they are gonna stay that way, and they are going to be needlessly vicious regardless. But one thing I'm gonna make a really big point of not doing in this video is talking in absolutes, because I don't believe in absolutes very much in general, and I certainly don't when it comes to these sorts of situations. There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of context, and people who come at it going, it's always this, or it's never this, or it should always be this. I don't like to deal in those kinds of terms, because there will always be exceptions to anything that always should or always shouldn't be the case. But let's talk about this casting, and let's get right down to it. So we are talking about the character of Danny Rand, aka the Iron Fist. Now, Danny Rand in the show and in the comics is white, and he has always been white in the comics. So having him cast as white is truer to the original source material. That's one thing to keep in mind. Now, I am not absolutely beholden to specific things. I think you can change anything as long as you have a reason to do it. The source material, no matter what it is, whether it's a book, a comic, an earlier film, or whatever, is not a holy text. But if you can remain true to the overall thing, you can change any number of things. You can change anything, really, as long as you can maintain the integrity of the piece. So the question becomes, if they were going to recast him, what would they have recast him as? Would that have caused new problems? Would that have fixed some problems? What are the pluses and minuses going into this? Now, I'm going to really narrow it down, and I'm going to say, like, the options were basically either leave him white, which again is true to the original comic books, or to make him Chinese or Chinese American. Now, I'm not saying he absolutely would have had to have been Chinese, but I'm going with that because Iron Fist is inspired by Kung Fu and Kung Fu movies. Kung Fu as a Chinese martial art, that entire sort of genre of film is more Chinese than anything else, but I'm going to use that term Chinese, but I'm not necessarily saying that it couldn't have been Japanese or Korean or whatever. Just sort of roll with me as I use that term and understand I'm not saying rigidly that's the only thing it could have been, because I mean, realistically, where this thing is set in the comics, it's a made-up country, it's a made-up martial art, and I understand that, but just let's move forward or we're never going to get done. So there are the options. So in terms of keeping him white, as I said, true to the source material. Are there problems with keeping him white? Actually, yeah. The big one, which I think a lot of people who wanted the character to be recast as Chinese or Chinese American were quick to bring up, is that Danny Rand kind of fits what is kind of known as the white savior motif, which is, it's a very old trope in really kind of any storytelling, any Western storytelling, and it's a problematic one. It's one that, as a society, we kind of have moved away from, but it's not. That's a fairly recent development. So, you know, going back to a character who was created in the 70s, like Danny Rand was, you're gonna run into this kind of thing. So, just to recap quickly, in case you don't know what that term means, it's when a character who is white and is presumed presumed to be a surrogate for the audience, and this is a trope that dates back to really the only people who could read, because this would have taken up, more in written stories, were white people, so it was safe to assume that whoever was reading the story was white and that the white person would be their POV character. But you send them into this other society, this other world, and they are brought in and embraced, and they are revered even within this culture that they have no place in. It's been around for a long time. If you want some examples just to kind of latch on to, the Tom Cruise movie The Last Samurai, Dances with Wolves, really any adventure story written in, say, the 1910s or earlier, that stuff is steeped in this. And even if the character doesn't become some sort of magical, mystical, gain the powers of this culture, the story is still being filtered through their eyes, so still through the lens of the white character, even if they aren't made into a savior figure. And in terms of properly valuing a culture that is a non-white culture, that is a bit of a problem. It's a very patronizing way to tell a story. So that's the first problem. The other one, which I think some people have brought up, and this is a more minor one, so I'll move on it quickly, is that Danny Rand, he looks a lot like Batman. And I don't mean in terms of the actual look, but I mean, you look at that first teaser that we got for Iron Fist, and that felt a lot like Batman, like Batman Begins specifically, which I think at this point it's safe to say is the dominant image of Batman's origin in the popular culture right now. So, lost his parents, wealthy white kid, in this secluded mountainous region of the world, learns how to fight and comes back and kicks crime's butt and retakes his family's company. That is true of both. And I think recasting Danny as a Chinese or Chinese American would have been one less thing that paralleled between the two. So if Disney had gone with a Chinese American actor, they would have lost the white savior angle. They would have differentiated from Batman, at least superficially, a little bit more. And now the question becomes, would there have been any issues with casting Chinese American? One that I've seen people bring up is the idea that as part of his training, Danny Rand didn't fit in this place where his family the plane had crashed, his parents died, and he was taken in and raised and trained, but he didn't belong there, and he had a sometimes antagonistic relationship with some of the people involved in his training, and that's kind of important to the character depending on the direction you actually want to go with him. And I've seen some people make the argument that you lose that if he is the same ethnicity as the people training him, and I would say that yes, but there's a way around that. So if they had cast a Chinese American, yes, he would have been the same race as the people who were training him, but he would not have been from the same culture. Because if he never lived in China or in that part of the world and wasn't raised in that culture and was just raised, like anyone born in America was, then rather than it being a racial clash, it becomes a culture clash. And I think you can still hit a lot of the same antagonistic beats, and in terms of them looking down on him, not having the same respect to him based on a difference in culture and not necessarily needing a difference in race to be able to do that. Although speaking of him being raised and the culture and all of that, there is one thing that they would have to kind of figure out a way to address if he was to not be white, because to make the Batman comparison again, Bruce Wayne being white eliminates the need to have to explain the fact that his family's rich. There's a lot of rich white families around, and there have been for a long time. Old money, we get it. And Danny Rand, kind of the same thing. Now, if he was a Chinese American, there would have to be some kind of explanation as to how he came to be in the position he is in terms of his family owned a company, because there really isn't much in the way of these sort of multi-generational, established big money in just that culture in America of people of that race. So it would require some degree of explanation. It wouldn't need a ton of time. I mean, it could be as simple as his dad was white, his mother was Chinese. And you cast a Chinese American actor and go, well, he took more after his mother. So there are ways around it, but I think that would require being addressed in some fashion. That's just a logistics thing. So right now, it is looking a bit like it just would have been a way better idea if Disney had just made the leap and recast him as a Chinese American. So are there any problems with doing that? Yeah. Actually, there are. There's a big one, and it has to do with stereotyping. So if Danny Rand isn't white, sure, we lose the white savior angle, but what we gain is a walking stereotype. Oh yeah, Chinese superhero, of course he does kung fu. What else was it gonna be? And the thing is, it's very obvious that Marvel and Disney are aware of stereotyping being a problem, and we've seen that with the changes that they made to the Mandarin and the Ancient One. In both cases, they were characters that were originally Asian, and when brought to film, were played by actors who don't racially look like the characters did on the page. But part of the reason, I don't think it was the only one, but I have no doubt that part of the reason that Marvel made that decision to make those changes is because those characters in their original comic book incarnation are walking stereotypes. The Mandarin is basically Fu Manchu with magic rings, and the Ancient One is just every ancient Chinese secret, mentor, teaching the ancient ways figure that you've seen in every kung fu movie ever. Now, I don't think avoiding those stereotypes was the only reason that those characters were changed, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on them, but it does seem to me that Marvel and Disney are very much aware that they are sometimes bringing characters to life that have issues with being stereotypes. And so I can see why that would probably be part of the calculation if it was ever a discussion in their offices that would be a knock against making Danny Rand Chinese American because suddenly he is a stereotype. So if you're still with me at this point, I am going to propose that basically we've got almost equal level problems. I don't want to have a debate as to whether a stereotypical race-based character is more offensive or in some way less offensive or better or worse than a white savior character. I don't know what the greater offense is. In my mind, you could make a case for either one. So I'm going to call it right now, we've got problems on both. And so it seems like, well, flip a coin. It doesn't seem to make a difference. We're in trouble either way. So we got to open it up bigger. We got to bring in more context. And by going bigger picture, I mean, let's talk about representation. Because if we basically come down to, look, having him be white has problems, having him be Chinese has problems, then we kind of got to go, who needs the representation more? And I think that's a really easy call. There are fewer examples of strong, heroic Chinese characters in American-made pop culture material for that entire racial group or anyone who feels a connection to that racial group to be able to look up to. They kind of need it more. And I think, in a lot of ways, it comes down to the question, even though the representation that a Chinese American Iron Fist would have offered would not have been ideal because it would have been stereotypical, is it better to have a stereotypical representation or no representation? And I would make the argument that the stereotypical representation is the better of those two options if that's all you've got to pick from. Because when you've got no representation, there's really nowhere for you to go. If you have representation but it's stereotypical or problematic, you can push it into a better direction. And I'll use some examples from pop culture. You look at the explosion of blaxploitation cinema in the 70s. You look at those films, the representation of blacks in those movies is not flattering at all. They are violent, misogynistic, they're pimps and they're drug dealers. I mean, it looks awful, but it put more and more and more black faces in cinemas in front of people so that from there they were able to go, okay, we have to move beyond that. And then we started getting more nuanced characters for black actors. And I think that's not even a fluke. And you can see that with other minorities as well. There was a really big explosion of gay-themed material sort of in the early 2000s. You had Will and Grace and Queer Eye from the Straight Guy, the Bravo channel, which is really heavily focused on LGBT as a demographic and in terms of what they're putting out there, all kind of came about at the same time. You go back and look at most of that stuff, it's stereotyped to hell. I mean, there's all these gay characters, but they're either, mincing little queens or they're, the Oscar Wilde kind of thing, and they're incredibly stereotypical, but they're a starting place. You get representation there first, and maybe it's not the best, but you can push to make it better. If you're not represented at all, then you've got nowhere to move forward on it. So once you bring that into the discussion, I do think, honestly, Disney would have been better off making Danny Rand a Chinese American than leaving him white. Now, I don't think there was any conspiracy or any degree of blatant racism involved in their decision to keep Danny Rand white. I think their decisions are all entirely business-based, but although I think even from a business perspective, I'm not entirely sure they made the right call. Especially considering, I mean, to bring up the Mandarin and the Ancient One again, they had two characters who really should, if they were going to be true to the source material, should have been played by Asian actors and weren't. Again, as I said, there were reasons for that, and I would say not entirely invalid ones, but you couldn't throw a bone back to the community that you kind of took two roles away from? I've just sort of arrived for myself. On balance, I think it would have been ultimately the better call. Not by a massive margin. Like I said, there would have been problems no matter what. I think bringing this character to the screen, he's a surprisingly problematic character if you actually dig down into him and into what's going on. So that's kind of where I land on it. What are your thoughts on this thing? Whatever you thought, drop a comment, a polite one, please, down in the comments. I don't want to have to close the comments on this. I've never done it before, but if the tone is anything like it was when I dared to bring up race in regards to Ghost in the Shell, then I'm expecting a ton of downvotes and an absolute disaster in the comments section. Could you pleasantly surprise me and keep it civil? I'm not saying don't have the conversation. I'd actually like to see the conversation, but I kind of like to see a civil one. So again, with great trepidation, I will ask whatever your thoughts are. Drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it politely again, please. But don't forget to like, subscribe, check me out on Twitter at Council of Geeks. Give a listen to the Council of Geeks podcast, available on iTunes and Stitcher. And until next time, this council is adjourned.